Yeah, I'm trying to get rid of some
You should be okay now.
echoes.
Okay. Right, well, the first thing I'd like to do, Roger, you and your team wrote a really interesting article around happiness and a wellbeing economy for Scotland. I'll put a link in the comments so we can all see it, but I'd just love to have a little bit of a summary from you. In your view, with what you looked at, how can Scotland become a much happier country than it is at the moment, and how can it be one of the happiest countries in the globe?
Oh, well, start off with a nice, easy question. Thank you for that. Basically, the way in which well-being and happiness is measured has led to the production of a number of indexes that list countries. And for a number of years in the main happiness index, small countries have tended to be at the top. So that Finland for the last 5 years has been ranked the happiest country in the world by the different measures that are used. And the UK, Scotland's not separately measured, but the UK is down in 17th spot, but quite a way behind Finland. Now, what we did was we analysed why this gap amongst all the variables, and we found that the gap was entirely the responsibility of only 2 of the variables that are used. One is in relation to the power, the freedom people have to make life choices, much higher in Finland than it is in the UK. And the second one was in perceptions of corruption in society. Much lower perceptions of corruption in Finland than, for example, in the UK. And there were 6 factors overall, but these were the 2 factors that explained the entire difference in scores between Finland and the UK. We also looked at it in relation to other countries that were higher than the UK, although we didn't report them all in detail in the report, but the same seems to be true. This actually relates to, fortunately, it was a happy coincidence that it relates to 2 earlier papers we produced through the bottom line. The very first one on the importance of agency in society, and why independence can release agency, not just to the state to make decisions, but for others to make decisions in their lives, freed from the helplessness that's induced by Westminster. And secondly, we had a fairly big paper itself on corruption and arguing that in actual fact, the UK state is well on the way to what's known as state capture. So that's that. We looked at in the paper, why do we want to look at things like well-being and happiness? And we thought we would reflect, first of all, in one of the main measures that's used at the moment to measure economies, and which has come in for a lot of criticism, and that is the use of GDP. Now, I actually think, and we actually think, GDP has a value in limited areas. And indeed, we're not alone in this. One of the architects of GDP, back in 1934, Simon Kuznets himself argued, this only measures a particular aspect of an economy. It does not measure what we would call nowadays well-being, satisfaction.
Roger, on the show, we often say that what you measure matters. And I think this is a really good example of that with GDP. What's measured by GDP tends to be what ends up mattering. So if you measure something else, there's a good chance that that'll matter. And GDP is really weak for anything outside of this consumption, this creation of goods and services, and it doesn't value a lot of other things in the economy.
Yes, it only seeks to measure at a gross level output in the economy. That's all it seeks to do. Now, I would argue that has some interest and value in that. I mean, I want to know that about the economy, but the notion that it gives you an overview of how well an economy is performing is just for the birds. So that, for example, we used a famous extract from Robert Kennedy's speech in 1968 during his campaign, where he was pointing out the many, many things that are important in life and in society that are not touched by GDP. You know, everything from the education of your children, the health of people, the happiness of people, opportunities to develop the arts, culture, creativity. All of these matters are important in our lives. None of them are measured by GDP. So that GDP has its uses, but in a much narrower range than is currently being used. But if I pick up on one thing you said, William, which I agree with, and that is GDP has become the international measure for many years now that is used when looking at the performance of economies. And you've got to ask yourself why, as yet, those of us like me who believe that there are things like well-being and the like that should have at least the same, if not more prominence, why has that not happened? Well, I think the reason is in part because we don't have an agreed definition and we don't have agreed metrics for well-being and happiness in society. So that we've reported some in our paper, but there is no doubt that other people who believe in well-being and the like will look at our paper and say, well, I would rather it was focused on this a little more or less on that. In other words, this is a field that's still under debate, whereas GDP has had the magic dust of being very simple and a simple wee equation that everybody could understand and buy into. Yeah. Right? But of course, it's vastly overinterpreted in terms of its meaning. Yeah. So I think those of us who believe in well-being have got to take on the responsibility. We have a lot more to do in getting the debate out there, getting people to realize how important this is. But secondly, we've got to take responsibility for agreeing what we mean by it and to developing ways in which we can test it, assess it, measure it.
Great. Yeah, some really good points there. I would add to that when Simon Kuznets and his team developed GDP, it was before the Second World War, and the American government wanted to know what was the productive capacity of the American economy. And I think you say in your paper, there's a quote from it said, the last thing you should do with this is use it to measure the well-being of an economy, but also kind of direct how an economy is developed. So even the person who developed it didn't want it to be used for what it's being used at the moment. But yeah, definitely it's difficult to try and come up with something that's so simple as that measurement. And there are measures. We've had one of the leading ecological economists from Australia, Philip Lawn, on here speaking about the Kieran, can you remember what his index was called?
Yeah, sorry, I can't. I'm just trying to recall it. But when we did on that program as well, I mean, it's interesting that Roger was bringing that up just now as well, because I read quite an interesting article in Holyrood magazine by Professor James Mitchell from Edinburgh University. He's a politics professor there. He's a fascinating person. But he wrote quite a excoriating article about the Greens and about their non-adherence to the use of GDP, which I thought was a shame that he said that, because he's a very educated man, but, clearly economics is not his thing. He's a politics professor, surely from a very scientific perspective, and I'm trying to always come from this perspective, is you would not use one measurement. Surely, surely you would not use one measurement. If you're running a country, you would look at multiple ways of measuring your economy, and you would collate that and look at that in the round. Surely,
yeah. It's the genuine progress.
I'll give Jim a round the next time I see him. Good, James.
Yeah, so it's the genuine progress indicator is one alternative that was developed in Australia, and I know they're looking for a PhD to kind of take that further forward. So Roger, I know there are other people looking at it. Jim, have you got any thoughts on GDP and the focus that we have, and maybe some of the alternatives as well?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose as I was listening to you there, I was thinking, well, the problem, although there's many models, as you have suggested, that we could use, the issue is the way that economics and kind of growth has tended to monopolize the whole idea of success for a country. and people in general, I think even when they're watching the TV, listening to politicians, the assumption is that these are the things that make you successful. When of course, that is just, everybody's kind of locked into something, and they're not really offered any alternatives. And it's not, for me, I don't think it's necessarily that we need to focus in any one model. What we need to do is think, well, we need to think openly about the idea itself, that there is a model that you can use to define success. People need to think about it more generally. Like, for example, I was listening to Warren Mosley, your favourite man, earlier on today, and one of the things he said was, that they was asked what would, he was actually talking about Scottish independence, strangely enough. What should the Scottish government do when it gets into power? And he said, well, they should decide what they want, what the priorities are for the country. And that's the first thing. What is it you actually want to do for people in the country? And that should be the list of the things that are the government programme. And some of that might be economic growth, in terms of GDP. But if the overall idea is that people should have greater well-being, people should have jobs, people should have a secure retirement to look forward to, all of these things are the things that should be the government programme. And it kind of jumps out of the idea that the government's job is somehow to think about GDP and growing it. It's kind of jumping out of the whole model, I suppose, of that way of thinking about it and taking a that's what monopolises everything at the moment. Clearly, within Scotonomics and the folk that you're chatting to, then there's plenty of people coming on there that are not stuck in that model, but the sort of general mainstream media is stuck on that. Yeah. And I think because they're stuck on that, a lot of the folks sitting watching that are also stuck on that. They can't see the break out of it.
It's difficult to break away from that, isn't it? Yeah. I know, going back to what a government should actually decide to do its role is, I think you're right. I think a lot of governments will say we've got to grow the GDP this year. Yeah. And I know we've got so Mariana Mazzucato, who came up with this idea of a mission economy. That's something similar. What is it that you want to do? And you can be kind of agnostic about growth. Now, Roger, I wonder what you thought about growth, because I was reading your report and it looked like you were still saying, hey, growth's really important, and growth's how we get to wellness. Is that a fair reflection of what you said, or is that only part of it?
Well, I don't dismiss the important. Growth is important, in my view. However, it is by no means the only thing that needs to be taken account of. And I would agree with a lot of Jim's remarks there. So that, I mean, if that's the only thing you look at, you're going to miss most of the things that are important to people in society, right? So that, for example, the way in which I would phrase it, I appreciated the way in which Jim was quoting others and phrasing it as, and yourself, William, about is this what, should the government have a mission? Should the government be clear about its policy priorities in the round? I would put it in a slightly different way, and that is the government listening to what the people want? And so that I think this idea of agency for us means that we need to find a way of giving greater prominence to the way in which people understand value in their own lives, in their own families, in their own communities, in their own societies, and the way in which they see responsibilities one to another in that way, because it is Adam Smith wrote tellingly about this in some aspects of the theory of moral sentiment, the way in which, as he put it, belonging brings us home to humanity. And that sense of belongingness and the way in which we value things, not just about our lives, but of other lives around us, we need to find a better way of giving prominence to that, of articulating that. And in that sense, I saw it put very nicely the other day by somebody whose name I forget now, who said, if you look at the issue of trust in society, it's not just that we want people to be able to trust their government, we want governments that trust their people as well. And I think those aspects are very important. At this stage, I'm certainly not clever enough to have all the answers. I don't know if anybody is, but I certainly think this is a worthwhile debate that needs being brought much more centre stage.
I mean, if you don't mind me saying, I mean, I read your paper earlier today, and I think this idea of agency is such a powerful idea, and unfortunately one that's missing from a lot of what we do in Scotland, and particularly missing from some of the poorer areas in Scotland. And when you were talking about saying trust the people, one of the problems I think we've got with a lot of our communities is they don't trust themselves because they lack confidence. They don't have that feeling of agency that they can actually affect things.
And that, of course, is why we've argued this. The alternative, the opposite of agency is helplessness.
Yeah, and I think that's unfortunately what we've got in a lot of cases.
Breeds a lack of trust, doesn't it?
Yeah. And why is that? Well, because we've already got a lack of agency.
Yeah,
we can't even vote for a government. We don't get it. Some other country votes it for us. So we've got this problem in Scotland, which I think leads to all sorts of psychological problems as well as feelings of disempowerment, etc. And it's actually a problem for Scottish independence that people do not take up. They don't feel empowered themselves enough, feel confident enough as in themselves and in their community.
I see the difference between living in Catalonia and Scotland and how much the local communities are involved in the decisions that they make. And I think one issue we've got in Scotland at the moment is that we've centralised power in Holyrood. And we really need to push that power out to not just local councils, but further down. And again, that's something I think is missing from the discussion around when we're talking about Scottish independence. And I think when we're focusing on the economic matters, we have to also cover power as part of the economy. We have to focus on, if you want the economic levers, that's where the power lies, not necessarily what those levers are, but you having the ability to do that. So it's back to the agency. And Karen, a question for you on the kind of local government. I mean, how do you feel about this idea of agency and what powers do you feel as a councillor in the local community has? And really, are there other powers that you think would be better placed within the community?
Yeah, I mean, both you and I are big fans of the concept of subsidiarity. I mean, absolutely, we want people in Scotland to run Scotland, and then further down, we want people in the communities to be much more involved. And certainly, in my ward, there are a number of groups that are quite active and know how to apply for money. The community councils get a budget every year. But they can apply for money on top of that because they're constituted. And if you've got active individuals, they can be really effective in their communities as well. So, it's for me as a councillor, I feel really passionately about that. And we've actually just started up a new community council in a part of my ward that hasn't been there for a few years. So I'm really hopeful that that's going to bring something to that community that it needs. Subsidiarity is really important. And I think, at that local level, when more and more people feel empowered and have that agency, that will bear fruit, for those communities, and hopefully as well for that confidence that, often, yes, I do feel Scottish people lack. When, after living in the Netherlands, I really felt that when I moved back. It's a different psyche here in some ways where, we're sort of, Scots were kind of battling and, we're courageous. And then on the other hand, we just think, oh, we'll never achieve that. And we shrug our shoulders. I don't know. It's like this kind of schizophrenic thing we've got going on in our psyche.
Yeah.
Roger,
also, sorry.
Roger, I'm just if you could just think about, or when you were writing the paper, what were the solutions to this apart from what we've said already, which is independence and giving us more agency? Was there any other ways that the country at the moment can move towards being happier? And what ways would we expect to be happier as an independent nation? And then, Jim, I'll bring you back into close.
Well, I think part of it would be reflecting on what Karen has just said, and that is, how are you going to stimulate agency? How are you going to get people involved? Now, I've been quite critical in the past of the structure of local government in Scotland. I think we need to have something that is much more bottom up than the way in which it was conceived. I mean, I think community councils are important, but the way in which structure and power has gone, they've not really taken off in many areas. And so that I think we would need to see much greater, as it were, devolution of authority over a number of things, including things that maybe nobody pays an awful lot of attention to at the moment, but should. I mean, for example, whoever studies whether people are just basically happy in their community? You know, I mean, this is not a trite question. This is important, but I don't know anybody who does it. So why couldn't we try and give people some, I wouldn't go as far as saying put the burden on them in terms of responsibility, but give them the assistance so that they can do things like that, so they can engage in communities to better understand how people are feeling and what's going on. So I think that's important. There are other practical things that can be done. I mean, one of the things, I would say this since I wrote the paper on corruption, but I certainly think there's a lot we could do to make society a lot less corrupt than it is, and it has increasingly becoming, particularly amongst, if you look at the political class in Westminster, for example. I mean, some of the things that go on there that are mentioned in our paper on corruption are, in my mind, no sane person would want to have a society being run like this and being influenced by some of the most malign people in society. So I think in different ways, there are different things that could be done, but the motivation has to be there amongst the people to want to do this. You know, we need to engage people in the debate, first of all. We need to get a commitment to people that, yes, this is something that is worth pursuing.
Yeah, it's a kind of cultural change we're after, really, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
You know, and it has to happen at an early age. It's got to be part of how people get educated at school. A whole different way of thinking about, as you say, empowerment and participation. I mean, when you were talking earlier on, one of the things that was in my head was a lot of these issues are actually some have to do with class and how poor people are in their communities. You know, you were saying, Kieran, earlier on about folk being very active and fundraising and doing stuff in the community. A lot of the time that can be quite middle-class folk that do these things, that write the letters to their MP, they fundraise for this, that, and the next thing. And folk who are poorer don't do that. they don't participate. And, I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm sure a lot of it's to do with confidence and poverty and, thinking about other things, trying to get enough money together to, to get the basics, feed their kids or whatever. So there's a kind of more fundamental inequality question in all of this as well.
It's the poverty of time as well, isn't it?
It's poverty of time, yeah.
That's right. Maybe you want to do it, but we all know how difficult it is to get to the things that you want to do when you're just doing things they need to do.
Educational attainment is heavily related to your class and how much money your parents have got and all that kind of stuff, and whether you've got a room to sit and study in, or you're in a one room with 10 people, whatever it is. What I mean? I'm over-egging the pudding, perhaps, but this idea that we have to get rid of inequality, we have to get rid of poverty, as well as thinking about the sort of higher ideas around all this other stuff as well. It's all part of the same problem of agency and confidence and feeling that you can change things. Even the idea that people don't always vote, from the housing estates. They may be the people who would get the most benefit, and those are the people that don't put their cross on the piece of paper and vote for things that would help them. And that's the same with the independence. I know I'm going on a bit, but I remember in Glasgow in 2014, a lot of the poorer areas in Glasgow did not vote, despite the fact that they had been counted as potential yes voters. So these are all issues which are related to what you're saying, is what agency, empowerment, confidence, happiness, well-being, all part of the same economic sort of whatever the word
Absolutely.
is after that.
Well, Roger, I know you're concerned about your wife's well-being at the moment. She's not very well. So thank you so much for joining us. And I do recommend to everyone that they look at that paper, and you find a link in the comments. It's the bottom line. It's bottomline.scot as well.
Thanks very much.
Roger.
Roger, thanks. Bye for now.
Thanks,
Bye for
Roger.
now.
Okay, and now there was 3. So thanks very much for your comments so far. My comment to finish on that was that, you know, we're always looking for a kind of silver bullet. What do we do? How do we do this? And for me, the problem is that the system's broken, and we have to change the system.
Yeah.
And, you know, tweaking around the edges and looking at how we do a little bit more of this or a little bit less of this or changing this is really not going to have the kind of seismic changes that we need. And that's why I'm so supportive of independence, because it allows us to look at the whole system and to start designing the system around the solutions that we want. Because with the system that we're in at the moment in Westminster, it is about tweaking and how can we change things slightly. And I don't think that's going to have the success in the areas where I think are most important. Before we move on, any final comments on that from our audience or from the panel? Karen, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say that, you know, what you just said there, Jim, about, you know, I saw that very acutely in my area. So in my area, there's particular deprivation in Seaton and Tillydrone. And, you know, during the voting, there were a lot of spoiled ballots. You know, people didn't really know how to vote properly as well. So it was particularly disappointing for us because you could see that they wanted to vote for us, but instead of putting numbers, they put crosses. So those were spoiled. So even though they wanted to vote, they didn't vote correctly. So that's a problem. And also as well, what I'd noticed before I became a councillor was that the more wealthy areas were managing to get money from the Common Good Fund because you know they're applying for the money. So you know, I felt that was one of the things I had to do once I got into was make sure that, you know, when I know there's money, I need to tell my communities this money's coming up. Apply for it, and there's a few people that are able to do that, and I just push that information towards them as much as possible. So as I say, we've got a new community council starting up, and you know, hopefully there'll be some things I'll bring back next year. I'm hoping that there's going to be a lot of progress with that, and they will have the things that the more middle class areas have as part of the course. William, you've muted yourself.
Lost the audio.
Okay, let's talk currency then. Jim, do you want to give us a little summary of the article that you wrote for Byline Scotland? I know you concentrated on 4 facts. So do you want to just first kind of explain why you thought it was important to cover the role of a potential currency in Scotland? And then can you briefly cover those 4 facts? Yeah,
sure. I mean, I suppose one of the things I'm trying to do with, you know, writing some of these articles for Byline Scotland, one of the things I'm trying to do is simplify as much as possible. I mean, I'm not that long into the whole idea of trying to understand this MMT and currency and economics. I mean, I did economics at my honours university, but that didn't mean that I learned an awful lot that's useful today, but at least it gave me some kind of ideas. So I've got quite excited over the last year or so about some of the ideas that were Stephanie Kelton's book, and then listening to SCOTONOMICS and the MMT podcast and all the other folk that are coming out of the woodwork and talking about similar things. So I was getting quite excited about it myself and starting to understand it. So I was thinking about it and think, well, how there's plenty of people out there that could understand this stuff. It's just, I suppose it sounds a bit dull and a bit boring and a bit dry. So how can I help in that process by trying to make things at least accessible through whatever channels are open to me? It was just kind of lucky that the Byline Scotland folk got in touch and happened to say, you know, would you be interested in writing something? So that's how I got started on that. So this current one was, I suppose, came from listening to the last SNP Scottish Government paper about the economy. I was listening to that, and then I was listening to a lot of the criticism that came after that. And I hadn't really seen anything that explained, why, for instance, Scotland should have its own currency. What were the issues around that if it didn't? Basically a summary of that area. So that's why I wrote that particular thing that was in the bylaw Scotland. I tried to do it, as I say, using these 4 facts, which I thought were irrefutable. Maybe somebody want to argue with that, and that's fine, of course.
So what are they? What are these 4 facts?
Okay. I panicked earlier on. I thought I better bring that up on the screen in case I can't remember. So I've got them up on the screen. So fact 1, Scotland using the pound, even without a formal monetary union, would be a currency user, not a currency issuer. Okay, I'll come back to these. I'll just tell you what they are. Fact 2, as a currency user, Scotland would have to borrow in a foreign currency to fund its policies. Borrowing in a foreign currency means taking on debt denominated in a foreign currency, which entails a risk of default and many other things, which I explain further later on. Fact 3, as a currency user, Scotland would have no control over monetary policy, and that's much bigger than it sounds. Fact 4, because one of the things that Nicola Sturgeon mentioned was we're going back into the EU. So fact 4, without a central bank, financial regulator, supervisor, and our own currency, Scotland would not be able to rejoin the EU. So those are the 4 facts that I put up, which I then discussed each in turn in the article. So I don't know whether you want to say anything about those, whether you think, no, you're not quite right there, Jim. These are not actual facts. They're just opinions.
Karen, do you want to go first on those, or do you want me to have a stab?
Yeah, no, interesting. I just wanted to bring something up, control over monetary policy. So, to an extent, you do have control over monetary policy if you're a currency issuer. But I was listening to another commentator over the weekend as well, and he made the really interesting point, and I'd been thinking this when this had happened, that when Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng did their fiscal event, then the Bank of England responded by doing something that would try to counterbalance that. And he described that as a coup. And I'd really been kind of thinking the same thing, which was, the Bank of England really were overturning what was going on here with the government so the government in that sense in the UK, even though they're the currency issuer, because they've given that independence to the Bank of England over the interest rates, that's where they have the independence. They don't have full monetary control. So that's an interesting thing.
I remember that at the time, people were saying, well, the UK government, trusts, etc., are doing one thing, and the Bank of England are doing the opposite. So they, it's just made it was absolute madness, quite frankly. I mean, it just sort of summed up the whole Westminster government at the time. It was complete madness.
Well, that's that 4th fact. Sorry, the 3rd fact was monetary policy. And I'd just like to add that how governments have been running the economy for the last 15 years has been using monetary policy. And under kind of a branch of economics, kind of monetarism, all the politicians and all the economists in place believe that this is how you control an economy, by manipulating the interest rates up and down. Now, there's another way of doing that, which is to use fiscal policy, which is your government spending into the economy and directing it more precisely. And that's what happened up until the neoliberal. And taxing. Spending and taxing, and that's how the neoliberal that ended with the start of the neoliberal era in the late 70s, early 80s. But separate argument whether or not monetary policy is better than fiscal policy. But what I think the viewers have to understand is that right now the main kind of economic mantra across the planet is that you use monetary policy to control your economy. If Scotland doesn't have its own currency, if it's using another currency, it doesn't just have something of it just doesn't have control of something insignificant like monetary policy. It doesn't have control of something incredibly fundamentally important, which is monetary policy. And I think that's really important, because you're right, Jim. And one of the reasons I really liked your article was because it was clear and it was to the point. And it was that if you don't have control of this, then you're not able to control how you run your economy.
Yeah.
And this is crucial for us to understand. And this would be the case under sterlingization.
Absolutely.
Scotland would be using the pound. It's not our money. We would still be a user of the currency and not an issuer. And we've covered in great detail that Scotland, even though we use the currency and we think of it as our own, we don't issue it. So we're not the owner of it. So it's a fundamentally important point, I think, this control of monetary policy.
Yeah, Scotland's economy would still be controlled by Westminster and the Bank of England. You know, if we were using the pound, you know, we don't have independence when our monetary policy is controlled from another country. Although, I mean, there's lots of things around about that. You know, you could talk about whether that would even be possible, of course, because I don't think the Bank of England would put up with Scotland having, you know, essentially a currency union for very long. And that's another argument for another day. So although we're talking about things here as if that was possible, it might not actually be possible in the first place, you know, because I don't think the Bank of England would be up for it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, the other aspect is that the fiscal. I mean, I think you said, to have fiscal control, you need to have monetary control, really. You know, there's been this little bit of a narrative going on that, you know, we make enough money in our taxes in order to cover our social security spending and all the rest of it. You know, so there's an element of, oh, but we could do fiscal even without changing our currency. But it's ignoring the fact that the majority of governments always spend more out into the economy than they tax back in order to leave money out in the economy,
Exactly.
around in order to exchange goods and services, or, you know, whatever that money is doing out there in the economy, even if it's in someone's bank account, getting ready to buy their new car or getting ready to buy their new washing machine. You know, you've got to have that money sitting out in the economy, and you cannot expect everyone to be borrowing from the banks to be doing all of those things all the time. You must have money sitting out in the economy. In order to do that, you have to be the currency issuer. It can't be any other way.
Yeah, totally agree. And that's what the article is arguing, basically, is that we need to have our own currency and we need to have those powers. Otherwise, we do not have independence. And we can't do the things, some of the things that Roger's talking about. We can't have a well-being economy. No. We can't have a green transition. You know, we can't do all these things that would make Scotland a better place to stay. You know, if we do the same things that Westminster is doing, we'll have the same result. Yeah.
Jim, we've got a couple of questions, so I'm going to cover. So the first one here from Ashbury was, I thought a central bank was planned to be ready by the time negotiations were complete. Do either of you want to answer that one, or will I take that one?
Yeah. So you know, obviously at conference we voted. The SNP party voted that we would be setting up a central bank as soon as practicable, as soon as possible, in fact. And certainly Nicola Sturgeon has spoken about that a little bit more openly recently. So yeah, that is the plan.
Yes, but of course, as Jim says in his article, you can't have a central bank if it's not the financial regulator and if it's not looking after its own currency. So exactly. You've really got to question what a central bank will be. And I'm not quite sure what the SNP have voted for, because it's like having a greenhouse that doesn't have any glass.
You can't have a currency without a central bank. So you need to build the institution first and then create the currency. The currency doesn't come before the bank. The bank comes first.
Yeah, but we've got a question here, which I thought a central bank was planned to be ready by the time negotiations were complete. Is that your understanding?
So we have asked at conference that we get the legislation ready for that as quickly as possible. Okay. That's what we've asked for.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason why not. I mean, you know, there's plenty of recipes out there that you can use to set it all up. There is no lack of expertise, I don't think.
And we've got a comment from Evelyn here. So our First Minister said our own reserve bank would be in place and the Scottish pound would be produced. That's true, Evelyn. But after a period of using sterling, which a lot of analysts think is likely to be possibly between 5 and up to 10 years. So
which is ridiculous. It can't work like that, you know. In my opinion, obviously. Sorry.
I would agree as well. So this is kind of what we're trying to cover, I think, is, you know, if Scotland does move to its own currency, which is the policy of one political party who may or may not be in power after independence, that's their policy. There are other policies available, and we are advocating a Scottish currency
Yeah.
as
I
soon
think
as
I've got to really make it really clear to both of you and to our audience as well, because I think a lot of people that are not in a political party don't understand this. So you go to conference, with your resolutions, you get your resolution passed, which me and Tim did get this resolution passed. The next thing after that, you have to get ministers to champion it because they're in power. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that's the next thing you have to do after that. So that's what happens next.
Yeah, which requires education of those ministers or some kind of influence, you know, because at the moment there does seem to be some fairly orthodox neoliberal ideas which are embedded within the SNP, you know, the leadership. They don't seem to have yet been touched, other than by, I think Tim Rideout did speak at the conference, which I think embarrassed some folk into, you know, at least amending what they wrote in the later papers. I remember the growth report, of course, which I know, you know, I've heard criticised quite often. I think it was changed after the conference. I think that did influence some of the folk within the SNP in terms of what they wrote in that recent paper about the economy. Some of the language was changed.
Yeah, I think we're definitely so there's some success to, but I think it's tweaking around the edges rather than making any significant difference. So we're going to go back to the article again. Let's look at your kind of first fact: was Scotland using the UK pound would be a currency user and not an issuer. So just clearly, where would you say the problem is? For very succinctly, what's the problem if Scotland is using the pound?
Well, if Scotland's using the pound, you know, we're still controlled by Westminster and we're still controlled by the Bank of England. If we want to borrow, then we're borrowing basically using a foreign currency, you know, and that costs money for Scotland to do. That's a bit like me borrowing for money for a mortgage to buy my house, and it comes with a debt, which, you know, we have to keep paying back over time, and so it's going to cost I think there's quite large startup costs. I know that's a strange word to use for a new country, but there are startup costs for a country. I'm going to be borrowing quite a lot of money, I think, to start with. You can call it a deficit if you want, but we'll be borrowing money to do these things. If you've got your own currency, there is no debt as such. You know, you're essentially, whatever the mechanism you use, and I know there's lots of stuff around the language we use for this kind of stuff, but you're essentially borrowing from yourself. You can argue about whether that's a good way of putting it or not, but the country is not taking on a debt if it's got its own currency, and it is taking on a debt if it borrows in a foreign currency. And as we know from looking at some other countries, that means that you can get into some pretty terrible problems and your country can go bankrupt, particularly if you're borrowing for a decade. You're trying to set up a new country, and it takes 180 billion pound to do a green transition, for example.
Jim, I'm just going to that's great. I'm just going to have to cover a couple of comments because we've got two comments here. And every time I'm asked about currency, I ask what will England use, as the pound is not the English. Look at the market in the Great British Pound. Okay, so I'm going to answer that, and then we've got a very similar point, which is that Scotland has a currency. And it's the reason we've got printed notes in Scotland. So thank you, John and Chris. I would refer you to an article, a really long article I wrote for Scotonomics, but I'll try and kind of be succinct as I can with this. The English pound, the pound sterling is issued by the Bank of England, which is the fiscal agent of the UK government. That's who owns the pound. Now, you can argue till you're blue in the face that it's our pound, right? But, you know, it's not. It's issued by someone who reports to the Westminster UK government. Now, a separate argument might be they might not be able to use the pound after it. I'm happy for you to go down that route, but certainly it's not Scotland's pound to use. Scotland cannot issue it. Currently, when you see a banknote that says Clydesdale Bank, if they still have them, or Bank of Scotland, the Mint in the Bank of England has said you can produce some notes, and we'll give you the certain amount that you can produce because that's, you know, that's under the charter, that's what you're able to do. But that money is still given to them by the Bank of England. So it's not Scotland's pound, it's issued and owned by the fiscal agent of the Westminster government, and there's no ifs and buts. And if I want to borrow one of Jim's phrases, that's a fact, and we can't move away from that. And I understand why there's a confusion, but it's not our pound, it's issued by somebody. So I hope that helps, and please
if I can interject just for a wee bit. I mean, I had the same issues myself in the past, trying to understand this stuff. You know, a couple of years ago, I would have probably said exactly the same thing, because I felt a kind of ownership for the pound. You know, that's my pound, etc. But the essential thing to understand is this argument of, you know, that first point. It's understanding that makes you understand this whole area. This idea of, you know, what do they call it? What was the first point I said? I can't even remember now. A user of the currency or an issuer of the currency. These two things, these two phrases are essential to understanding this stuff. A user of the country is Scotland right now. We get a grant, we use the pound, you know, where it's limited. We have no more money than what we're given, other than a very small amount we can borrow from the UK government. And then the issuer of the pound is the Westminster government. And if the Westminster government says, I want to build a new, huge, modern bridge to go across some mile-long piece of water, they say to the Bank of England, issue this amount of money to build that bridge. And they issue that money. They are the currency issuer. They say, I want some money to buy a big warship. They say to the Bank of England, issue that money to build that warship, and so on. Scotland can't say, issue some pounds for COVID support. They haven't got a pound in their pocket to issue. They don't make pounds. We are a user of the currency. That is the essential thing in all of this, is understanding that. And it took me a while to understand it. And I think it will take people, you know, who are new to it a while to understand these things. But I think that's the essential starting point for understanding a lot of this, is this issuer and user idea.
Oh, you've cut yourself off again. Can't hear you, William.
Chris, we would love to have you on a journey with us to, you know, for allow us to explain a little bit more about the difference, because, you know, you're saying it's issuance. The only difference is issuance being by the Bank of England. If you understand what money is, money only has value because someone trusts that the Bank of England will be there to back that pound. So if you start issuing money and there isn't a fiscal agent behind it to back that money up, it's worthless. It's like the three of us on screen and you coming up with the Chris Fisher pound. You can issue that, but it won't have any substance. It won't have any moneyness because there's no one there backing it. Because that is the whole, that a pound, any currency, is trust in the issuing agent. So you're saying it is about issuance, and it is absolutely about issuance. It's the fundamentally it's the fundamental most important point. And my final point before Kieran jumps in is, as you said, it might be in the treaty. Okay, you know, and this is a separate issue. The pound is issued by the fiscal agent of the UK government, and when we leave, we will have to come up with something else unless we use their pound, and that's a fundamental point. And maybe it's about exchanging for assets. All these things are separate, which you mentioned. But so, Chris, thank you so much for your points, and that's why we're here, is to try and explain this. Kieran, you had a point there.
Yeah, I think the other thing we keep forgetting about when we talk about currency is the opposite side of that equation is tax, because tax is the coercive thing that makes you want the currency. You need the currency to pay the taxes. The tax coerces you into doing things that the government wants you to do. That's fundamentally why currencies were created in the first place and why they exist. So the taxation is really important. Now, we are not, you could describe it as we are not tax sovereign either. So again, on the radio, I listen to Radio Scotland all the time in the morning. You know, there's this thing about talking about, well, for example, they were talking about the National Health Service today, but can't we tax people more? So a lot of people don't understand that although we do income tax here, we don't do other forms of taxes. So we don't do VAT, we don't do corporation tax, all of those kind of taxes, we don't control those. They're all controlled from Westminster. We also don't control how tax escapes from our economy, as in the tax havenry that we were talking about with one of our guests. So we can't control whether it stays in Scotland either, because it can escape out of Scotland, it can escape out of the UK and literally be buried in Treasure Island. So we can't control where it is. So if we don't control tax, we can't control the currency. Now, on a domestic level, that the taxation is making your currency valuable. On an international level, it's valuable if you make stuff that people internationally want to buy from you. And if they're buying stuff from you, then fundamentally you can buy stuff from them.
Absolutely, there's two sides to it. Okay, we've been on for 52 minutes. We've still got comments coming in. I did want to talk about the article that I wrote because it was 3,000 words, and I should have been studying for my masters rather than doing it. So we'll put a link. But basically, there was a report that some of you may have seen by Professor Ronald MacDonald, that's his actual name, saying that the Scottish pound would devalue 30%. I think he was saying, although it wasn't clear because his analysis was only 644 words. I'll say that again, 644 word analysis. And he explained, probably the wrong word, that it would fall 30% immediately or very quickly after it was issued. So my article looked at actually was that likely and what was the method and the rationale behind that. And the reason I did that was mainly because it instantly got a lot of coverage within the kind of unionist Twitter sphere, but also in the union press, the unionist press. And I think it's really important that we all take a step back and we realize two things. The first thing is that someone can knock up a website, can produce an analysis that's got 644 words that says something pretty much unsubstantiated, something cataclysmic to the Scottish economy, which would be a 30% drop almost overnight in the currency, and it gets a huge amount of amplification. And that's a democratic deficit, and I think we should be really concerned about that. Now, if my article was picked up by the same people and got that coverage, I would be really concerned about it because it's not in-depth enough for these organisations to be picking up and putting on the front of the pages. And that's a huge issue that we have a media that is able to and happy to pick up something. Now, in no way is it analysis. I mean, I've just finished a master's degree. Kieran's done a science degree. You just heard from Jim there, who said he's done an economics degree. There's no way that this would even pass a university level in terms of analysis. And it's really worrying that was the case. Now, if you can look at that separately, but you also have to look at what the case actually said. And what he was suggesting was something that's never happened to any currency in any modern Western economy, a 30% drop. And I go into detail how, and I almost say it's kind of almost economically impossible for this to happen because it's likely that it would be pegged and the government would be backing that. And speculators would know that if they bet against the Scottish Reserve Bank, they would lose. So this keeps it within some kind of peg. So I've covered this in a lot of detail. I'd love you to have a look at it. But I just wondered, Jim, does that article tie in to what you were talking about with this currency and this idea that people need to know the difference and to understand the things that are likely and unlikely to happen to a Scottish currency?
I mean, I think it does in as much as people, I believe that people need to learn at least a little bit about economics and currency in this area. And something, I read your article earlier on, and it makes sense. I mean, basically, from my point of view, the article that Ronald wrote was just a piece of propaganda. There was no evidence in it for anything. It was just a unionist bit of propaganda to be amplified in the newspapers, because that guy happened to be somebody who didn't like independence. That to me was a piece of lightweight journalism at the end of the day. Now, the reason that it's important for people to understand at least a small bit about economics is that they wouldn't necessarily recognize that was the case unless they did know a little bit about economics. You could read it and you can say, this is a load of nonsense, really. And then you can write a big long article about it and refuting it. But most people will read it and they'll think, well, maybe he's got a point. I don't know, because they don't have any kind of education in this dry area called economics. So, you know, my big thing with trying to write these articles is at least to introduce people to the idea that it's possible to learn some of this stuff. It's not that difficult. If you do learn a wee bit about it, then these articles will have less of an impact overall, because folk will look at them and think, don't think so.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I contacted the professor and said, what's the methodology that you've used? And he got back to me and said, it's the beer methodology used by the IMF. And I don't think he expected me to go and look at what that was. So I went and I spent a couple of hours looking at that. And I'm sure I could have done much more. You know, if I would have had to do this properly, I would have spent a couple of weeks investigating behavioural models of exchange rates. But I was able to spend a couple of hours and say, well, that's a model. I found a European Central Bank paper that said that when they used it to predict something, which is exactly what he's doing, they used his model on various economies. And the economy on which it scored poorly on was the United Kingdom, and it described the results using the beer model as highly inaccurate. And MacDonald came back and he said, I expected someone would have got the wrong end of the stick here. Beer models are not used for prediction. And I said, that's what I think. So why have you used the beer model for prediction? Because this is exactly what you're saying. But it opens his article. You were able to criticize it in 1,000 different ways because there was no methodology, facts or figures or data sheets or anything behind it. And my final point on that is it's a real concern that the unionist press will pick up something that someone that hasn't even spent any time doing. And if I was to write an article that would hopefully get some coverage saying why I reckon the Scottish pound would stay parity with the Scottish government, I could spend with the English pound, I could spend 3 months doing that and have a 40-page article with 100 references. It wouldn't get any coverage because it's not what the unionist supporting press, and that's a huge problem. So my kind of appeal to everyone who's watching is that we have to amplify the things that the Scottish independence movement are doing in economics, because if you look at the coverage that report got, it will be 100 times what my response was. Now, am I the person who should have been responding to that? Probably not. But if you read the article, at the end of it, I think it's solid enough that you would say, I'm going to take that prediction with a pinch of salt. So I think it's really important. And that's tonight. This is the reason why I wanted to do the episode tonight, because I think it's important for us to highlight the good work in some of the articles that have been written. So I thought the ones that we've covered tonight have been really, really good. Kieran, I'm going to give you the final word if that's okay, because just a second. In terms of this idea that the Scottish currency would drop overnight compared to the UK and the democratic deficit we've got with the economic coverage and the education that needs to take place, any final thoughts on that?
The main thing that really shocked me when I read through the website was that a professor, someone with a chair, wrote, "All the experts agree," which is, I don't know any experts that always agree, and I just found it just incredible that someone who has a chair would actually write that. I think it's quite embarrassing for him, to be frank.
Yeah. I think the line is if the only time two economists agree is when they're criticizing another economist, and that's it. And that's it. But please do read the 3 articles we've covered tonight. I'll put the links in the comments when the show's finished. Jim, as the first time you've been on the show, we'd love to have you back, but I'd love to give you the final thoughts. I'll see if there's any other questions while you sum up for us, if you don't mind.
Yeah, okay. I don't know if I can sum up. I mean, I can tell you what's in my head at the moment, which is that I can understand why Ronald MacDonald, is that his name? Yeah, would say what he's saying, because we're all viewing the world through different belief systems, through, there's ideologies or whatever it is. And we have a particular outlook which produces the articles that we're writing. And we support independence. We support probably a kind of left-leaning view of economics. Whereas Ronald has a different viewpoint, and we've all got different viewpoints. And this is the issue with all of this stuff on the TV or whatever articles we write. We all have a certain beliefs which we grow up with, and our background, our class, and all that kind of thing. And all this stuff is normal to us. So I'm sure when he wrote that article, he was writing and probably being sincere in terms of who he thought he was writing it for. His own peer group would all agree with it. And, you know, it's a kind of, those daft independence folk, they really don't have a clue. We understand this economic stuff and they don't. And I'm sure he was quite kind of serious and sincere when he did it, in the same way as we are when we try to write our articles. So we have to understand, I suppose, in summing up, that we're all viewing the world differently, and we're all kind of true within the bubble that we're operating within. This is part of the problem, I suppose, with trying to persuade other people to support independence. They are in their bubbles, we're in our bubbles. How do we, as people who are trying to educate other folk about, you know, not yourselves more than me, I'm just starting out in this, but how do we kind of get over that idea, you know, of trying to influence people that have a different worldview or a different way of interpreting the world? It's not a summary of what we spoke about, but it's what was in my head when you asked me to say that there.
Lovely way to finish. Absolutely. And, you know, it is, I think the approach that you've taken with the fact-based approach is really important. And, you know, if people do read my article, I tried to evidence everything that I'd said as much as I could, you know, and I think that's really important. Do look at Professor MacDonald's and see if you can see any peer-related, peer-reviewed articles or comments from other papers or anything like that, and judge it or judge it against that, because it looks a little bit like a short opinion piece to get the coverage that he was hoping to get. Thanks very much, Jim. It's nice to have you on the show.
No, nice to see you
hopefully
both.
We'll see and hear from you soon.
Yeah, nice to speak to you. Okay.
Bye now. Kieran, interesting show for us this evening, and we've been going for an hour, so thanks everyone who's stayed with us. I think we'll head off now. We've got 3 or 4 fantastic interviews coming up over the next few weeks, so do stick with us. I'm going to put a link to our subscribing to our mailing list as well, because I'm not sure if we haven't discussed this, Kieran, but I'm not sure what our thoughts and views are on Twitter. I'm keeping that as a channel for communicating with our audience. So please do sign up to our newsletter. We've got over 100 people who are following us, and also there's the opportunity of joining us on Patreon as well.